All right, I think the best way to kick off this series of what I consider contributing factors to first responder and military mental and physical ill health would really be discussing what happens before we ever put the uniform on or put a badge on our chest. More often than not, what I see is, oh, James is struggling because he had that decapitated child on that call with that crew. And yes, a call like that, which is a very real call for me, is definitely a contributing factor. It's a, yet another straw on the camel's back, as they say. However, more often than not, we never discuss what happened to us in our formative years before we ever put the uniform on. I have seen through so many interviews, over 700 conversations now, that so many people in the first responder and military professions have a significant amount of childhood trauma. Now, that trauma could be sexual abuse and some of these horrific things that I've heard, and it could also be being adopted, being the middle child, a seemingly lesser trauma, but equally as traumatic to that individual, that feeling of not being secure, not being loved, etc. So having this discussion of what happened to us prior, and I will get to some actionable solutions in a little bit, is an imperative conversation. This, I think, is one of the underpinnings of why sometimes we lose people who, for example, in the military never saw combat, or in the fire service was only on 6 months before they took their own life. I'm going to use a very childlike illustration, but I think it's a good analogy for the difference between someone who's able to be resilient within the fire service, cope, and then someone who struggles. And it's the exact same blank canvas. So we're born as infants, okay? We have a whole world ahead of us. And then the environment that we're born into obviously is a contributing factor. Now, there are a number of elements that can create a healthy, warm, safe household, or a very toxic, scary, unsafe household. So you've got two similar infants, okay? We will start by the perfect one, okay? They are loved. They don't really have any kind of trauma at all. They start going through school and with a very, very solid foundation, get to high school, apart from some little hiccups. Now they're entering the fire service with a pretty solid foundation. So even if we get to here and, this is our first couple of years and there's a couple of crappy calls, okay, well, you still got a great solid foundation. You progress through your career, maybe like with me, you even have a divorce, pretty horrific divorce, take that out. Still stability, okay? And I don't have to keep going on with that analogy. All right, let's take person 2 now. They are born, same blank canvas as a child. However, as they go through, there is adoption, there is physical or mental abuse, there is growing up around alcoholism. So what happens, alcoholism, maybe some of the domestic violence that's witnessed before, okay? They're driven into these professions. I think this is a very important point. A lot of us want the buck to stop. So there's an element of wanting to be the protector because of your childhood. And there's also an element of the adrenaline, the camaraderie, the purpose in our professions that in some way allows us to bury what happened to us before. Chad Belger, a local firefighter, perfect example. Horrendous childhood. And he used the military and then the fire service to keep engaged. Ultimately, got to the point where he was suicidal and has an incredible kind of rise from the ashes story, that once he addressed that thing, the thing beneath the thing, as Jake Clark says, he was able to then be a mentor in his community and use his story to heal others. So we're in this person with the less fortunate childhood, okay? So now, we've got high school, maybe there was some bullying, and then we get into the fire service, okay? Now, this is already being dealt with. So what you might see is, maybe one side here, is the healthy side, but now there's some sort of unhealthy coping mechanism, whether it's alcohol, whether it's, some sort of opiates, etc., etc. So then you add in these horrendous calls, and now the foundation is completely messed up. So very, very trivial, basic example, but all it takes then is that one call, that one relationship problem, that one issue with their child, and all of a sudden, the foundation comes down. These two same people, maybe in their career, had the same kind of stressors, but it was the foundation that was crumbling. So this is what I've seen. Almost every single person I've had on the Behind the Shield podcast who has either actually gone through with their suicide attempt, however they survived, or so many people that were right there and were stopped by a child, a sibling, an animal, whatever it was, a loved dog. They reported the same thing. There's so much focusing on what we had in our career, but ultimately it was something that really had the nucleus way, way earlier in their childhood. And you'll hear even some of the veterans I've had on the show that, were blown up, that were shot, that lost limbs. Their mental health struggle, really, the nucleus of it was, again, prior. So how do we fix this? This is one solution that I have that I truly believe would cost $0. I had the very fortunate perspective of working and testing for 4 fire departments. So I went through their hiring process, on 4 times, 4 different places. And one common denominator amongst all of them was what's called, and I'll check my notes here, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory Test. Hundreds upon thousands of questions that you're there with a bubble answer sheet going, do you like flowers? Do you like animals? Do you like sports? Do you like touching children? Do you like building Lego? And then you're like, well, when I found out from the psychology world, this is not a well-respected test, especially for what we're doing, because it really boils down to, are you being honest or are you not? The other thing that 3 out of the 4 times I did was the polygraph. I can tell you, if you research polygraph, you'll realize that ultimately it's kind of a smoke and mirrors thing. It's trying to get people to confess the things that they've done. What this whole environment fosters is this concept that to be a police officer, to be a paramedic or a firefighter or a soldier, you have to have been a choir boy, never done anything wrong. The reality is, what makes a great responder or soldier is someone who's seen some things, done some things, but then had the ability to process that, learn from that, and then move on and be a resilient responder. So if we create this fallacy that you need to be an angel, have never done anything, you're creating lies. I had to lie my way through 3 polygraphs. I've done some stuff, nothing horrendous, but I've tried some things, danced a lot, hugged a lot of people, and ended up having a great career in the fire service. So the polygraph and the psych test, clearly we're talking about hundreds of dollars for those to be administered for each candidate. What I would argue is you take that money and you hire a counselor, either within or contract, that's actually competent as far as culturally, so knows how to work with fire, police, EMS, or military if it's in that side. And you give them, I'm just pulling a number out, 5 sessions as you go through the new hire process, through probation or orientation or whatever works for you. Now they have the ability to process what they brought into the profession, because once processed, that's how you forge resilience. Left unchecked, buried down, as the Mexican proverb says, they tried to bury us, they didn't know that we were seeds. So the more we push it down, the more it's growing inside, and it will come out. It's not if, it's when. So you take that same money, you give these men and women the ability to have several mental health exercise sessions, as we do PT on the drill ground. If there's nothing to process, beautiful. Worst case, you've now created a relationship with the counselor from the front door, and you've normalized mental health conversations. Well, more than likely what's going to happen is some things are going to start coming out. And as they progress through, if you give them the opportunity and remove the barrier to entry, i.e. finance, you have someone on staff that these men and women can come and see, you are now going to give them the ability to process their trauma. I was almost killed in a house fire when I was 4. I was almost killed by a wall in our family car, I think when we were about 8. My parents had a pretty horrific divorce. So these all happened in my early life. But I was very fortunate enough through my childhood to have some things inbuilt by accident that allowed me to process them and became a resilient responder. I would argue you can take almost anyone. The background check is how you filter us out. If we have, abused people or done all the things that are truly illegal and immoral, that's going to show up in our background check. So that's how you filter people out. But once they fit these physical standards, educational standards, and background standards, why not use the same concept we have on physical fitness and apply it to mental fitness? So that is kind of my very brief analogy on this. If we miss the foundation, and I'll get to all the things that are set up for us to fail within the fire service that we can change, that are also preventable, But if we're not having the conversation of what happened to our responders, and I'm not talking, oh, you had something bad, therefore you're disqualified. If you've been through trauma and you're able to process this, you will create some of the most incredible police, fire, EMS, etc., because they've been there. They can relate to some of the things that we see and do. I argue they would be more compassionate because they know what pain feels like. But how inspiring that you've gone through these, these things that so many of my guests have, and then you can grow from them, and then you can be a beacon. And you can tell other people, I was there, and look where I am now. So, same exact budget, take it from these two elements that really are just that there's not backed in science and they're not progressing, and it's not working because we have a mental health crisis. So if they worked, we wouldn't have one. Take them into proactive counseling and look at it the same exact way as your PT. If you can own your physical fitness, you should be owning your mental fitness as well. Now, as far as, I'm going to stop the camera then, as far as resources, The Body Keeps the Score, an incredible book by Bessel van der Kolk. That will guide you more on childhood trauma. I said I was going to give you some resources at the end of each of these videos. Jake Clark was my guest on episode 63 of Behind the Shield podcast. I recommend, because he was really the first one that opened my eyes to the power of childhood trauma. Listen to that as a resource, and then my book, which I haven't even got to hold up, but One More Light. All my entire podcast is free, but if you wanted to purchase a book, One More Light is a series really of short stories from my career, but it's not a biography. Each chapter is a takeaway on physical health, mental health, overcoming injury, all these other areas. So it's from a firefighter's perspective. So that is another resource if you want. But this whole video library, the podcast, all those areas are completely free. So I hope this helps. I hope this sows some seeds and sends you down a rabbit hole. Cheers.